Do you want to know how a simple cleaning girl managed to do something that the best doctors, therapists, and psychologists couldn't? How she gave back to a man something he thought was lost forever? Let me tell you this story from the beginning, because you won't believe what happened. His name was Conrad Ashford, 37 years old, the most feared Mafia boss in all of Chicago. Or rather, he used to be. Because ever since that cursed night 2 years ago, when a bullet from his own sworn brother lodged in his spine, Conrad had become nothing more than a man trapped in a wheelchair, watching his empire be run by lieutenants who pretended to respect him while whispering behind his back. That Tuesday morning, Conrad sat in his office in the penthouse on the 50th floor, overlooking downtown Chicago. A space that once gave him power now only reminded him of everything he had lost. The smell of expensive bourbon mixed with the scent of Italian leather couldn't mask the bitterness rotting inside him anymore. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows displayed Chicago moving far below, millions of people walking, running, living their lives, something he would never do the same way again. His longtime estate manager, Judith, entered with her usual efficiency. Her heels clicked against the cold marble floor like drums, announcing yet another disappointment. "Mr. Ashford, Mrs. Dorothy won't be able to come to work today. She's seriously ill with pneumonia, but she sent her daughter to substitute temporarily." Conrad barely looked up from the reports he was pretending to read. "Send her away. Hire a professional cleaning company." "I've already tried, sir. No one will take the job. They're afraid." Conrad let out an irritated sigh. Since the assassination attempt, he had become an expert at pushing people away. It was easier that way. Fewer pitying glances, fewer forced attempts to brighten his day, fewer people trying to treat him like some broken, pathetic cripple. "Fine. Let her come up, but warn her that I have zero patience for small talk or family drama." 15 minutes later, she walked in. And when I say walked in, I don't mean she crept in quietly or asked permission in a hushed voice like everyone did with him now. She simply knocked twice and entered as if she had every right to be there. The first thing that caught Conrad's attention were her eyes. Brown, direct, without that expression of pity mixed with discomfort he had grown so accustomed to seeing. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. No more, no less. Said, "Good morning," in a firm voice, and began organizing her cleaning supplies, as if he were just another piece of furniture in the office. Conrad tested her. Of course he tested her. It was his standard method. "Do you know who you're talking to?" he asked in that tone that made his men tremble. She stopped organizing her cloths and looked at him again. No fear, no submission, but also no defiance. Just naturalness. "Yes, sir. You're Conrad Ashford, the man who's been paying my mother for 15 years of work. And I'm Pearl, Dorothy's daughter. I'm here to clean your office while my mother recovers from pneumonia." Her voice had a different texture. It wasn't polite in the formal sense he knew, that artificial politeness of his subordinates. It was genuine respect. Natural. Like someone who had learned to respect people not out of fear, but out of principle. "I don't want conversation during work," Conrad said, expecting to see her shrink. "Perfect. I prefer to work in silence too," she replied, and went back to what she was doing. For the next 40 minutes, Conrad pretended to work while watching her from the corner of his eyes. She cleaned each surface with almost artistic precision, wiping the shelves following a specific pattern, as if every movement had purpose. The soft sound of cleaning products mixed with her quiet footsteps created a strangely peaceful atmosphere. But what intrigued him most was how she handled the space around his wheelchair. Everyone, doctors, physical therapists, nurses, his own men, always made this theater of special care around him. They spoke slower, moved as if he were made of crystal, asked him 1,000 times if he needed anything. She simply cleaned around him, as she would clean around any other person. When she needed to reach something behind his chair, she said, "Excuse me," and waited for him to move himself. She didn't try to push him, didn't do the job halfway to avoid bothering him. She just waited. That simple gesture, waiting for him to move on his own, hit Conrad in a way he didn't expect. For 2 years, people had been doing everything for him before he even asked, as if his ability to make decisions had been left in that bullet-riddled car on the highway. When she finished, she arranged the products with the same meticulous organization with which she had cleaned everything. The office smelled of lavender and fresh cleanliness, but without that chemical excess that gave him headaches. "All done," she said, putting her bag on her shoulder. I'll come back tomorrow at the same time, if you agree. Conrad should have said no. He should have dismissed her right there and called the most expensive cleaning company in the city. But something in those 40 minutes had been different. Fine, he murmured, already going back to pretending to read reports. She nodded and left. No, thank you so much, sir. No forced smiles. No promises to do the best job of her life. She simply left. Conrad sat alone in the silent office, breathing in the lavender scent, trying to understand why that interaction had affected him so strangely. For the first time in 2 years, someone had entered his space without treating him like a problem to be solved, or a delicate situation to be handled. She had treated him like a man, just a man, and he had no idea how much he had forgotten that was even possible. If you want to know what happens next between the most dangerous man in Chicago and the cleaning girl who wasn't afraid of him, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who believes in love against all odds, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss a single chapter of this incredible journey. The next day, Pearl came back right on time, just as she'd promised. She knocked twice, stepped inside with the same easy naturalness as the day before, and started her work without needing anyone to tell her what to do. Conrad sat in his office, pretending to read a financial report, but his gray eyes kept sliding toward her through each page. He wondered whether her calmness yesterday had only been a performance for the first day, or whether that was truly who she was. Most people tried to seem normal at a first meeting, but by the second, the third, their real nature would show. They'd start asking about his health in a voice heavy with pity. They'd try to help with things he didn't need help with. They'd stare at the wheelchair longer than they looked into his eyes. But Pearl didn't. She worked in silence, moving around the room with a precision as if she'd already memorized every corner of every shelf, every surface of every table. When she needed to wipe behind Conrad's chair, she said 2 words, "With your permission," and waited. No pushing, no pulling, no doing it for him, only waiting. Conrad wondered where she'd learned that patience that didn't feel forced at all. Then he remembered. Pearl was Dorothy's daughter, the woman who had cleaned this penthouse for 15 years without once complaining or prying into what the master of the house really did. Maybe discretion and respect for boundaries were things passed from mother to daughter. By the 3rd day, Conrad decided to truly test her. He'd watched long enough, seen enough composure, and now he wanted to know where her limit was. When Pearl walked in, he wasn't sitting in the office as usual. Instead, he waited for her in the hallway, his wheelchair blocking the passage that led to the library. "Today you're cleaning the room inside there," he said, his voice without emotion, his finger pointing toward the closed oak door. "No one has gone in there for a long time." Pearl followed the direction of his hand, then nodded. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what was inside. She didn't ask whether there was anything she needed to know first. She simply went to get additional supplies and pushed the door open. The room inside looked like an abandoned battlefield. Books lay scattered across the floor, some torn, white pages strewn everywhere like dirty snow. The leather armchair had been knocked onto its side, one leg broken. The paintings on the walls hung crooked, and some had fallen, their glass frames shattered. A crack ran along the wall, the trace of things that had been hurled hard into it. The smell of mold, mixed with the odor of old liquor, making the air heavy, suffocating. This was where Conrad hid on nightmare nights, where he destroyed things when despair became unbearable, where growls and shattering glass replaced the crying he never allowed himself to let fall. No one was allowed in here. No one was allowed to see this madness. Until now, Conrad watched Pearl's reaction from the threshold. He waited for shock, for fear, or at least for curiosity she couldn't hide. He waited for the question, what happened here, that anyone would ask when faced with this. But Pearl only stood still for about 5 seconds, her brown eyes sweeping over the room once. Then she turned to look at him, her voice as calm as if she were asking about the weather. "Do you want me to arrange the books in alphabetical order, or by subject?" Conrad stood at the threshold, watching her work without saying a word. Pearl's question about how to arrange the books still seemed to hang in the air, calm to the point of absurdity. Anyone else would have asked what had happened, would have looked at him with worry or fear, would have searched for an excuse to leave as quickly as possible. But she didn't. She only waited for an answer about the books, as if this ruined room were nothing more than an ordinary mess that needed to be cleaned. "Alphabetical order," Conrad heard himself say, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Pearl nodded and began. She picked up each book from the floor, brushed off the dust, checked whether it was damaged, then stacked it into neat piles. The torn ones she set aside. The loose pages she gathered carefully. Not a single sigh. Not a single shake of the head. Not a single judging look. Conrad rolled his chair inside and stopped in the corner to watch. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe a crack in her calm exterior. A moment when she'd let curiosity or disgust slip through. But Pearl only kept working, her calloused hands moving gently and efficiently. Then she stopped in front of one section of shelving. Conrad recognized it at once, the spot where he'd hidden the books he didn't want anyone to see. Books about medicine, about rehabilitation, about spinal surgery, about experimental treatments. Books he'd read over and over in the first year after the assassination attempt, when he'd still had hope, when he'd still believed that one day he would stand up. Before that, hope died and left bitterness behind. Pearl lifted one of those books and flipped through a few pages. Conrad saw the folded corners, the underlined lines, the notes in the margins in his own handwriting, proof of the desperation he'd tried to hide from the world. He waited for her to say something, a comment, a question, even just a look of pity. But Pearl did nothing. She only studied the books for a long moment, then stood, reached up to the highest shelf, the place Conrad couldn't see from his wheelchair, and placed every one of the medical books up there, one by one, carefully, as if they were valuable objects that deserved to be kept in the right place, not thrown away, not buried, just set where he didn't have to look at them every day. Conrad felt something tighten in his throat. She understood. Without him explaining, without him saying a word, she'd seen those books and understood what they meant. Understood they were memories of a hope that had died. Understood that seeing them every day would only rub salt into the wound. And she'd quietly put them away. Not a word, not waiting to be thanked, not turning it into a dramatic moment. She'd done it as if it were simply the obvious thing to do. For the next 2 hours, Pearl turned the chaos into an orderly space. The books went back on the shelves in order. Broken objects were cleared away. Dust was wiped clean. The armchair was set upright again, even though one leg was still broken. She even opened the window so fresh air could pour in, driving out the stale smell of mold and old liquor that had settled there for far too long. When she finished, the room still had cracks along the wall, still had marks of destruction, but it no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a room that had witnessed suffering and was slowly healing. Like me, Conrad thought suddenly, and immediately pushed the thought away. "I'm finished," Pearl said, standing in the middle of the room with dust on her hands. "There are some broken things I can't repair, but I've cleaned up the shards. Do you want me to call someone to replace them?" Conrad shook his head. "No, leave it." Pearl nodded, not asking anything more. She gathered her supplies and prepared to go, but at the doorway she stopped and turned to look at him. "Mr. Ashford." Conrad lifted his head. "Those books," Pearl said, her voice gentle but certain. "I put them on the highest shelf. If one day you want to read them again, just tell me, and I'll take them down for you." Then she walked away, leaving Conrad alone in a room rich with the scent of lavender, with a heart beating in a rhythm he'd thought he'd forgotten long ago. She understood without him explaining, and that silent understanding was more frightening than any question. A week had passed since the day Pearl cleaned the ruined library, and Conrad realized he'd been waiting for the sound of her knock each morning. It irritated him. He was Conrad Ashford, the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago, the man who made the entire underworld tremble, and now he was anticipating the arrival of a girl who mopped floors, as if it were the most important thing in his day. Ridiculous. But he couldn't deny that this penthouse had changed since Pearl came. Not only cleaner, but less suffocating, less like a cage. And he, too, was changing, even though he didn't want to admit it. He was less sharp with Paxton and Judith. He started eating on time instead of drinking liquor in place of meals. He even began doing again the rehabilitation exercises he'd abandoned a year earlier. All small changes, he told himself, had nothing to do with Pearl, even though deep down he knew he was lying to himself. That afternoon, Conrad called Paxton into the office. He was a 45-year-old man with a solid build and the sharp eyes of a former Special Forces soldier. And he was also the only person Conrad still trusted after Brock's betrayal. Paxton had been at his side for 20 years, from when Conrad was just a kid stepping into the underworld to when he became its ruler. If there was anyone Conrad could hand his life to, it was Paxton. "I need you to investigate someone," Conrad said, his voice calm as if he were ordering an inquiry into an ordinary business partner. "Pearl Whitmore." Dorothy's daughter. I want to know everything about her. Paxton raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask why. After 20 years, he'd learned not to ask questions when Conrad used this tone. He only nodded and left. 2 days later, Paxton returned with a thin file. Not thin because there wasn't information, but thin because Pearl Whitmore's life held nothing complicated. She didn't have dark secrets, no shadowed past, no connections to any criminal organization. She was simply an ordinary woman with a life full of hardship. Pearl Whitmore, 27 years old. Paxton read from the report. The only daughter of Dorothy Whitmore. Father's name, Richard Whitmore, left when she was 10, without a word of goodbye, without a single dollar of support. After that, Dorothy raised her alone. Conrad listened in silence. She's in her final year of nursing at a community college, Paxton continued, working 3 jobs at the same time, cleaning here in her mother's place, working the night shift at a cafe, and doing an unpaid internship at a free clinic for the homeless. She sleeps about 4 to 5 hours each night. 3 jobs, Conrad repeated, his voice dropping. Yes, boss. And there's more. Paxton paused briefly. Dorothy has chronic lung disease. The hospital bills are very high. She's carrying massive medical debt. And it looks like loan sharks have gotten involved, with brutal interest. What kind? Conrad asked, his gray eyes darkening. The kind without morals, Paxton replied. The kind that'll take the house and the kidneys if she can't pay. Conrad gripped the armrest of his wheelchair. Anything else? One more detail, boss. Paxton hesitated. She was engaged once. The fiancé's name was James, a construction worker. He died 3 years ago in a workplace accident. The scaffolding collapsed. Conrad said nothing. She paid for his funeral. Paxton added, she's still paying. That's part of why she's in so much debt. Does her record have any stain at all? Conrad asked. No, boss. Completely clean. No criminal record. No involvement with drugs or any illegal activity. She's just a normal person trying to survive. Conrad looked out the window, where Chicago was sinking into the light of sunset. 3 jobs, a severely ill mother, debts piling up, a fiancé gone, and she still came here every day with calm eyes and not a single complaint. She carried a weight that could crush anyone, yet not once did she let her exhaustion or despair show. It reminded him of himself, before the bullet changed everything, before he turned into a bitter man who did nothing but push people away. That night, Conrad couldn't sleep. He lay in bed in the vast bedroom, eyes fixed on the ceiling, his mind unable to stop circling what Paxton had reported. The weight of her world felt crushing. He couldn't shake the image of her carrying the grief of a lost love and the burden of her mother's life on her slim shoulders, yet still standing tall without a single complaint. She was only 27, and she'd already carried more than most people faced in an entire lifetime. But what Conrad couldn't stop thinking about wasn't Pearl's situation. It was the way she faced it all. No complaints, no playing the victim, no trying to use anyone's pity. She just worked, day by day, with a steadiness he couldn't understand. Then sleep finally pulled him under, and with it came the familiar nightmare. He was standing in a dark room, surrounded by the laughter of men he'd once trusted. Brock stood in front of him, wearing that friendly smile Conrad had known for 20 years. Then the gunshot cracked. Pain tore through Conrad's back. He went down, his legs going numb, and Brock stood over him, still smiling. "I thought you were my friend," Conrad heard himself say, his voice like a groan. And Brock laughed even harder. "A friend? In this world there are no friends, Conrad. Only the ones who use, and the ones who get used. You were just too naive to see it." Conrad jerked upright, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering as if it wanted to burst through his ribs. The room was pitch dark, only the city lights slipping through the curtains in faint streaks. He pressed a hand to his chest, trying to control his breathing. Just a nightmare. Just a nightmare. But it wasn't only a nightmare. It was memory. It was the reality he had to live with every day. His shout must have carried through the penthouse, because only a few minutes later he heard a soft knock at the door. Not Paxton's urgent knock full of worry, and not the hesitant, fearful knock of the staff. Just 2 calm, even knocks. "Mr. Ashford," Pearl's voice came through the door. "Can I get you a glass of water?" Conrad wanted to roar at her to go away, to tell her he didn't need anyone's pity, that he was completely fine. But what came out was only one hoarse word. "Go." Silence for a moment, then Pearl's voice again, still as calm as ever. "All right, I'll leave the water outside your door." Light footsteps moved away. Conrad lay still in the darkness, staring up at the ceiling, trying to rein in his heart, still beating wildly. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't try to push her way in to comfort him. She didn't overreact. She only offered a glass of water, and when he refused, she respected it. Simple, normal, no drama. 10 minutes later, Conrad rolled to the door and opened it. On the floor, right in front of the threshold, was a glass of water and a cool cloth folded neatly. No Pearl, no worried eyes, no curious questions. She'd left the things there and gone back to work as if nothing had happened. Conrad picked up the glass and took a sip. The cold water slid down his throat, easing the raw dryness. He looked at the cool cloth, then looked down the dark hallway, where light from the living room spilled a faint strip across the floor. Pearl was there, cleaning as usual, as if his shouting had been nothing more than a passing gust of wind. As if a mafia boss having nightmares in the middle of the night were the most ordinary thing in the world. The next morning, when Conrad rolled out into the living room, he saw Pearl wiping the windows. Early sunlight streamed through the glass, catching in her chestnut brown hair and turning it into a soft halo. She turned when she heard the wheelchair, nodded in greeting, and went back to her work. Not a single word about last night. Not a single look of worry or curiosity, as if it had never happened. Conrad sat there watching her, and he realized something strange. For the first time in 2 years, someone had stayed after seeing him at his worst. A rare sense of peace washed over him, something he hadn't felt since before the betrayal. She'd heard him screaming in the night like a wounded animal, yet the next morning she still looked at him with those calm eyes, as if his darkness wasn't enough to frighten her. After that night, Conrad knew he couldn't just sit and watch anymore. Paxton had reported on the loan sharks, and Conrad knew that type. They didn't stop at threats. They'd go to Dorothy's house, they'd pound on the door at midnight. They'd intimidate the two of them with words he didn't even want to imagine. And Pearl, with that stubborn streak of hers, would surely try to protect her mother by any means necessary, even if it meant putting herself in danger. He couldn't allow that to happen. "Take care of the loan sharks," Conrad ordered Paxton. "No violence. Just make them disappear and never come back to bother the Whitmore family again." Paxton nodded. "And the hospital bills, boss?" Conrad was silent for a moment. "Pay them all. Every last bit." Paxton lifted an eyebrow but said nothing. He understood this wasn't the time for questions. "And Paxton," Conrad added, his voice colder, "no one is to know about this, especially Pearl." "I understand, boss." 3 days later, everything was handled. The loan sharks received a visit from Conrad's men. No violence, only a short conversation and a few names mentioned, enough for them to understand whose protection the Whitmore family was now under. The debt was wiped clean. Not a single dollar of interest. Not a single threat. Dorothy's hospital bills were paid in full as well, with instructions that the hospital was not to reveal the payer's identity. Conrad thought it would all be smooth. He was wrong. A week later, Pearl walked into his office with fire in her eyes. She didn't knock twice the way she always did, didn't say good morning in her usual calm voice. She only stood there in front of him, both hands clenched at her sides, trying to restrain her anger. "You paid my mother's hospital bills." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Conrad looked at her, his face unreadable. "Consider it a bonus for her 15 years of work." "No." Pearl shook her head, her voice trembling from the effort to hold herself back. "That wasn't a bonus. That was pity money. And we don't need charity. That's not—" She cut him off. Something no one had dared do in 2 years. "You think I don't know? The loan sharks suddenly disappear. The hospital bills suddenly get paid off. You think I'm stupid enough not to notice?" Conrad said nothing. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone with no power in his world. But the way Pearl stood there, unafraid, refusing to step back, made it impossible for him to respond the way he normally would. "I just wanted to help," he said, and immediately realized how weak it sounded. "Help?" Pearl laughed, but there was no joy in it. "If you want to help, then pay me a fair wage. Don't turn me into your debtor. Don't make me feel like I'm being bought." She stopped, drew in a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I'm not something you can buy, Mr. Ashford. I don't need anyone to save me. I only need to be treated fairly." Then she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Conrad alone with a shock he hadn't felt in years. In his world, money could buy anything: loyalty, silence, even love. He was used to people taking his money with gratitude, or at least with acceptance. But Pearl didn't. She'd looked him straight in the eye and refused, not because she was arrogant, not because she wanted to play hard to get, but because she had principles, because she had self-respect, because she didn't want to owe anyone anything, even when that person could give her everything. Conrad sat in silence in his office, staring out the window where Chicago was sinking into the late afternoon light. And for the first time in his life, he realized there were things money couldn't buy. She was the first person to refuse his money, the first person to look him in the eye and say she didn't need his pity. In his world, everything had a price, but she didn't, and that made her priceless. After the confrontation with Pearl, Conrad didn't see her for 3 days. She still came to work on time, still cleaned the penthouse with her usual meticulous care, but she avoided his office. Judith reported that Pearl finished faster, more efficiently, and left earlier. She didn't ask about him, didn't send any message, as if that conversation had closed a door between them. Conrad told himself it was better that way. He was a Mafia boss. She was the cleaning woman's daughter. The distance between them wasn't just money or status, but secrets, danger, darkness he didn't want to drag her into. Better that she stayed away from him. Better that everything stopped here. But on the 4th night, when Conrad was alone in his study at midnight, unable to sleep because his thoughts kept spinning, he heard sounds in the hallway. Light footsteps, a door opening softly, objects being moved with care. Pearl. What was she doing here at midnight? Conrad rolled out of the room, following the noise to the living room, and he froze. Pearl was kneeling on the floor, scrubbing a stain on the carpet he hadn't even known was there. She wore her cafe uniform, as if she'd just finished a night shift and come here to do extra work before going home. Her hands moved slowly, tiredly, but still careful down to every detail. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Conrad asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Pearl lifted her head, not seeming surprised to see him. "I have a key. Judith lent it to me so I can work more flexibly. I just finished my shift at the cafe, and I figured I'd get the cleaning done before I go home." Conrad looked at the clock. Nearly 2 a.m. "You work until this hour?" Pearl shrugged and kept wiping the carpet. "The night shift ends at 1. This penthouse needs to be cleaned every day. I'm just making use of the time. When do you sleep?" Pearl paused, looked at him for a moment, then went back to work without answering. That silence was answer enough. She didn't sleep. Or at least, she didn't sleep enough. 3 jobs, a sick mother, debt, and now cleaning a penthouse at 2 a.m. Conrad wondered how long she'd been living like this. Conrad rolled closer and stopped a few steps away from her. "About the hospital money. I didn't intend to apologize for paying it. But I'm sorry I didn't ask you first." Pearl stopped scrubbing and looked up at him. Her brown eyes were tired, but still sharp as always. She didn't speak, waiting for him to go on. "I'm used to using money to solve problems," Conrad said, his voice lower. "In my world, money can buy most things. I forgot there are people who don't want to be bought." "You didn't buy me," Pearl said, her tone less harsh than before. "I know you didn't mean harm, but you need to understand that I've taken care of myself and my mother for 17 years, since my father left. I don't need anyone to save me. I only need a fair chance to save myself." Conrad fell silent, turning her words over in his mind. Then he spoke, slowly, weighing each word. "Then I'm offering a new arrangement. Not charity, not pity. A real job, with pay that matches it." Pearl lifted an eyebrow. "What job?" "I need a medical assistant who doesn't look at me with pity. You're studying nursing. Apply that knowledge here. It's a professional contract, not a favor. Enough for you to pay your debts and keep studying without working 3 jobs at once." Pearl stared at him as if trying to read the real intent behind the offer. "And what's the condition?" "Keep confidential everything that happens in this penthouse," Conrad replied. "Don't tell anyone about my work, about meetings, about the people who come here. Can you do that?" Pearl was quiet for a long time. Then she said, her voice firm, "I have a condition of my own." Conrad waited. "I don't take part in anything illegal. I clean, I manage schedules, I read legal reports, nothing else. If you ask me to do anything against the law, I'll leave immediately." Conrad looked at her, and for the first time in many years, He felt something close to real respect for another person. She knew who he was, knew what he did, and still drew a clear line without fear. "All right," he nodded. Conrad saw Judith standing in the doorway, her face cold, her eyes on Pearl with undisguised wariness. "You can't trust an outsider like that, Mr. Ashford," Judith said, her voice sharp. "She's only the woman who saw him." Conrad turned his chair, looking straight into the eyes of the housekeeper who'd served him for 10 years. "She's the only person in the last 2 years who hasn't tried to please me. No flattery, no fear, no pity. That's why I trust her." Judith fell silent, but her gaze remained full of doubt when it slid toward Pearl, and Pearl didn't seem affected by the clear hostility from the housekeeper. She only stood there, calm as ever, waiting for the final decision. Finally, there was a soul by his side, whose loyalty wasn't bought with a paycheck. She was here because of a fair agreement, and that honesty was worth more than any loyalty he'd ever bought with money. A month had passed since Pearl became Conrad's personal assistant, and the penthouse on the 50th floor had changed in ways no one would have expected. Not a change in what you could touch, but a change in the air, in the energy, in the people living inside it. Conrad was less irritable, less destructive, less inclined to lock himself away in the dark. Paxton noticed first, and then Judith, even though she still kept her guarded stance toward Pearl. They whispered to each other in shadowed corners, wondering what the girl who used to mop floors had done to change their boss so completely. That afternoon, Conrad was in the rehabilitation room. It was the room he'd avoided for a full year, the place filled with training equipment he'd once thrown against the wall in anger. But lately he'd started coming back, one step at a time, even though the progress was still slow and painful. Dr. Raymond, the 50-year-old man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, had left long ago. Conrad stayed behind alone, trying to do the exercises the doctor had shown him. He hated this feeling, hated the helplessness, hated having to struggle against his own body. But he kept trying, for a reason he didn't want to admit. The crutch in his hand slipped, and Conrad lost his balance, crashing down onto the floor with a loud thud. Pain shot up from his hip and spread through him. He lay there, breathing hard, staring at the ceiling, and the familiar sensation of despair began to crawl up his throat. 2 years. 2 years, and he still couldn't stand on his own. He was still useless, still crippled, still the man even his own people whispered about behind his back. He swung his arm and hurled the crutch toward the wall, the metal striking with a shrill clang. "Useless," he growled at himself. "Useless. Do you know what nurses call what you just did?" Pearl's voice came from the doorway. Conrad turned his head and saw her standing there with a tea tray in her hands, her face calm as if her Mafia boss lying sprawled on the floor and cursing himself were the most ordinary thing in the world. "What?" he snarled. "Pathetic?" A step forward. Pearl set the tea tray down on a nearby table and walked over to him. "Because at least you're trying. A lot of people in your position would have quit a long time ago." Conrad stared at her, unable to find words. He was used to people pitying him, soothing him with empty lines like, "Everything will be fine or you'll walk again." He hated those words because they were lies. But Pearl didn't lie. She didn't promise anything she wasn't sure of. She only saw the truth, that he was trying, and she acknowledged it. "Can you help me sit up?" Conrad heard himself ask, his voice smaller than he'd meant it to be. For the first time in 2 years, he was asking someone for help on purpose. Pearl didn't look surprised or triumphant. She only nodded, stepped closer, and held out her hand. She didn't try to haul him up the way others always did, making him feel like a piece of cargo that needed to be moved. She simply offered her hand and waited, letting him decide how he wanted to accept help. Conrad took her hand, and with just enough support, he pushed himself up and sat with his back against the wall. Pearl sat down beside him, keeping a careful distance, not too close to intrude, not too far to seem cold. "You're studying nursing," Conrad said. It wasn't a question. "Why?" Pearl looked toward the window, where late afternoon light was turning the Chicago sky gold. "Because I want to take care of people the right way, not the kind that's pity or just getting it done. I mean really helping them, respecting them, letting them decide their own lives." Silence for a moment. Then Conrad asked, his voice lower. "Paxton's report said you were engaged once." Pearl didn't seem surprised that he knew. Maybe she'd guessed that someone like Conrad would investigate her. "James," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "He was a construction worker." Conrad waited, not pushing. "We met at the cafe where I worked," Pearl went on, her eyes still on the distance. He came in every morning, always ordered the same thing, always left a tip even though it was obvious he didn't have much. He wasn't rich, he wasn't powerful, he wasn't handsome in a magazine way, but he looked at me like an equal. Not the waitress, not the cleaning woman's daughter. Just me. She paused and drew in a deep breath. 3 years ago, the scaffolding at the site collapsed. He didn't come home again. Conrad didn't offer the kind of cheap condolences he'd learned meant nothing. He understood. Words like that didn't change anything. Instead, he only sat there in silence beside her, the two of them looking out the window as Chicago slowly sank into dusk. "That's why I'm studying nursing," Pearl said after a long while. "I want to save people like him, even if it's only one." Conrad looked at her, and for the first time, he saw a small crack in the calm armor she always wore. She'd lost the man she loved, but instead of letting the pain swallow her the way it had swallowed him, she'd turned it into fuel to help others. She had loved a man not for money or status, she had loved him for equality, and Conrad wondered whether a man like him could ever be loved that way. The news about Sterling Vance's moves came on a morning of wind and rain. Paxton walked into Conrad's office with a face more tense than usual, and Conrad knew at once that something was wrong. "Sterling is applying pressure," Paxton reported, setting a folder on the desk. "He knows you're getting weaker after the assassination attempt. He wants to take over the North Side territory." Conrad frowned, flipping through the pages. Sterling Vance was the Mafia boss who controlled the South Side of Chicago. A greedy, ruthless man Conrad had kept in balance for years. But since Conrad had been paralyzed, that balance had begun to tilt. "How many men does he have?" Conrad asked. "Enough to cause trouble," Paxton answered. "But not enough to face us head-on. Not yet. So what is he waiting for? Waiting for the right moment." Paxton hesitated. "And there's more news, boss. About Brock." Conrad went still. That name. The name he'd tried not to think about for 2 years. Brock Morrow, his sworn brother. The man who'd been at his side since they were street kids. The man he'd trusted with his life. And the man who had shot him in the back on that fateful night. "He's alive," Paxton said, his voice dropping. "We thought he died after that, but he didn't die. He's working for Sterling now, his right hand." Conrad felt the blood in him boil. 2 years. 2 years living with legs that felt nothing. With nightmares about that night, with the pain of betrayal, and the man who caused all of it was still alive, still breathing, still laughing at him from the other side of the city. "He's alive," Conrad repeated, his voice like ice. "The man who shot me in the back. Alive." Rage flared, and Conrad swept everything off the desk with a loud crash. Papers exploded across the room, the coffee cup shattered, black liquid spreading over the white carpet. Paxton stood still, unmoving, too used to his boss's anger. But there was someone who wasn't used to it. Pearl was standing in the doorway, holding a stack of documents she'd meant to bring in. She'd seen everything. The fury, the loss of control, the glimpse of the monster Conrad tried to hide. Her brown eyes weren't afraid, but they weren't calm the way they usually were either. There was something in that look Conrad couldn't read. "I'll come back later," she said, her voice steady, then turned and walked away. Conrad wanted to call her back, wanted to explain, but he didn't know what to say. He'd just let her see the worst part of him, the part he'd worked so hard to keep hidden. "Paxton," Conrad said after a long silence, his voice calmer now but still cold as steel. "From now on, put someone on Pearl 24 hours a day. Quietly. She doesn't need to know." Paxton nodded. "I understand, boss." And Paxton. Conrad looked straight into the eyes of the most loyal right hand he had. "If Sterling or Brock so much as touches her, I'll burn the entire south side of Chicago to the ground." Paxton didn't look surprised. After 20 years, he understood his boss better than anyone. He knew Conrad Ashford never made empty threats, and he also knew that the girl who used to mop floors had become more important to his boss than anyone had been in many years. That night, Pearl was on her way home after her shift at the cafe. She walked through familiar streets, her mind still turning over what she'd witnessed in Conrad's office. She'd seen his rage, seen the way he lost control, heard the name Brock and the way Conrad reacted to it. She didn't know the details, but she was smart enough to understand that man was tied to Conrad's deepest wound. She was thinking about it when she realized someone was watching her. A black car was parked at the corner, lights off, but the engine running. When she walked past, the car began moving slowly behind her. Pearl's heart beat faster, but she didn't show fear. She turned into an alley, hoping it was only a coincidence, but the car followed. She sped up, almost running, when suddenly, another black SUV appeared from nowhere and blocked the car that was tailing her. The SUV door opened, and Pearl saw Paxton step out. He didn't look at her. He walked straight to the other car, said something to the person inside, and a few seconds later that car backed up, turned around, and vanished into the night. Paxton turned back toward her, gave a small nod, then got into his SUV and drove away without a word. Pearl stood there in the dark alley, her heart still pounding. She understood that Conrad had put protection on her without her knowing. She also understood that someone was following her, and it had something to do with the dangerous world Conrad lived in. The next day, she confronted him. "Someone followed me last night." Conrad didn't look surprised. "Were you hurt?" "No, but I'm not stupid, Mr. Ashford. What's going on?" Conrad was silent for a moment, then sighed. "One of my enemies is watching. They may have learned you work for me. You need to be careful." Pearl looked him straight in the eye. "Are you telling me I could be in danger because I work here?" Conrad nodded, not dodging it. "But I won't let anything happen to you. That's a promise." For the first time, Conrad was afraid not for himself. He was afraid for her. And that fear was more terrifying than any bullet. The annual Chicago Mafia party was held at the end of the month, and Conrad had no choice but to attend. It was an unwritten obligation, the place where bosses met, negotiated, and measured one another's strength. Being absent meant admitting weakness, and Conrad had endured enough whispers behind his back over the past 2 years. The penthouse was dressed in lavish splendor for the event, candles flickering, crystal glittering, the scent of expensive wine and luxury perfume mingling in the air. Men in tailored suits and women in evening gowns moved through the rooms, smiles on their lips but eyes sharp as knives. This was Conrad's world, the world he'd ruled for years, but now he had to command it from a wheelchair. Pearl was asked to assist at the party in a server's role. She wore a simple uniform, her hair pinned up neatly, weaving among the guests with a tray of drinks in her hands. Conrad tried not to look at her too much, but his eyes kept searching for that small figure in the crowd without his permission. Then Irene Castellano arrived. She entered like a queen, a blazing red gown clinging to a perfect body, sleek black hair spilling over her shoulders, her sharp eyes sweeping the room until they landed on Conrad. Irene was the daughter of Castellano's boss in New York, a mafia family as powerful as the Ashfords. Before the assassination attempt, there had been a marriage agreement between the two sides, a strategic alliance between two empires. But after Conrad was paralyzed, the agreement was canceled. Irene returned to New York, and everyone assumed it was the end. But tonight, she was back. "Conrad." Irene strode up to him, her smile sweet but her eyes calculating. "You still look as strong as ever." Her voice was honeyed, but Conrad could hear the falseness tucked inside every word. He knew Irene didn't care about his health. She cared about power, about position, about whether Conrad was still worth investing in. "Irene," he gave a cool nod. "I'm surprised to see you here." Irene laughed softly, laying a hand on his shoulder with an intimacy he hadn't invited. "I missed Chicago. And I missed you." She stayed at his side all evening, coaxing, flirting, laughing with a charm that had been carefully engineered. Other guests watched them and whispered about whether the marriage agreement might be restored. Conrad endured it all with a blank expression, but inside he only wanted the night to end. Then Irene saw Pearl. The girl was passing by with a tray of champagne, and Irene immediately caught the way Conrad glanced at her. Only a heartbeat, but enough for someone as sharp as Irene to notice. "Oh, and who are you?" Irene called Pearl over, her voice high and clear, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "Are you the cleaner?" Pearl stopped and turned toward Irene with calm eyes. "I'm Mr. Ashford's personal assistant." Irene gave a short, mocking laugh. "Personal assistant? How interesting." She deliberately tilted the champagne flute in her hand, and as if by accident, the liquid spilled onto the floor right at Pearl's feet. "Oh, I'm sorry. I spilled my champagne. Clean it up." The room went quiet. All eyes turned toward them, waiting to see how Pearl would react. Some people giggled, enjoying the little spectacle. Irene stood there with a triumphant smile, waiting for the floor girl to bend down and accept the humiliation. Pearl didn't move. She looked Irene straight in the eye. No fear, no anger, only that composure no one seemed able to shake. She was about to kneel, not in submission, but because she knew this wasn't a battle worth fighting. But before she could do anything, Conrad's voice cut through the air, cold as steel. Irene. Irene turned, the smile still on her lips. What is it, darling? Pearl is my personal assistant, Conrad said, each word clear and unyielding. Not your servant. If you need someone to wipe up champagne, I'll call someone else. The room fell utterly still. No one dared breathe too loudly. Conrad Ashford had just openly defended a floor girl in front of Castellano's daughter. It was something no one had ever seen before. Irene stood there, her smile dying, her face flushing with humiliation and fury. She wanted to argue, to say something. But when she looked into Conrad's cold gray eyes, she knew she'd lost. Pearl stepped forward, her voice calm. It's all right, Mr. Ashford. I'll call someone to clean it. Then she turned and walked away, her back straight, her chin lifted, not letting what had just happened touch her. She wasn't timid, but she was smart enough not to create more trouble for Conrad. She left with her dignity intact, and that was more impressive than any sharp comeback could have been. Irene had everything: beauty, money, status, but she didn't have what Pearl had, a self-respect that couldn't be bought or humiliated. After the party, when all the guests had left and the penthouse had returned to silence, Conrad found Pearl standing alone on the balcony. She looked down at Chicago at night, the city lights shimmering like a golden carpet stretching all the way to the horizon. Cold wind swept past, lifting a few strands of hair loose from her neat bun. But she didn't seem to notice. Conrad rolled up beside her and stopped at a distance that felt right. Not so close that it invaded her space, not so far that it felt cold. They stood there in silence for a long time, watching the city below together. You shouldn't have had to endure that, Conrad finally said, his voice lower than usual. Pearl turned to look at him. I'm used to being looked down on, Mr. Ashford, but thank you for speaking up. Conrad looked at her. Moonlight fell across her face, bringing out the delicate lines he'd never truly noticed before. Or maybe he had noticed, and simply hadn't wanted to admit it. Conrad, he said. Call me Conrad when we're alone. Pearl was quiet for a moment, as if weighing it. Then she gave a small nod. Conrad. The sound of it, his name in her voice, stirred something in his chest. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had said his name like that. Without fear, without flattery, simply normal. Do you know why I'm in a wheelchair? He asked, not knowing why he wanted to tell her. Pearl looked at him, her brown eyes waiting. I heard it was an accident. Conrad gave a bitter laugh. An accident. That's what they call it when your sworn brother shoots you in the back. Pearl didn't look shocked or pitying. She only listened, silent, patient. I trusted him like blood, Conrad went on, his eyes fixed on the far line of the horizon. 20 years. We grew up together on the poorest streets in Chicago. I shared everything with him. Secrets, plans, dreams. And in one night, he took my legs away. He stopped and drew in a deep breath. That night, we were in a warehouse on the edge of the city, a private meeting, just him and me. I didn't suspect a thing. Why would I? He was Brock, my brother. Then I heard the gunshot, felt pain rip through my back, and I went down. When I looked up, he was standing over me, smiling. He didn't give more details. He didn't have to. Pearl was smart enough to understand the rest. I understand what betrayal feels like, she said after a long silence. Not the way you do, but I understand. Conrad looked at her, waiting. My father left when I was 10, Pearl said, her voice gentle but steady. Not a single explanation, not a single goodbye. One day he was there, the next day he was gone. My mother cried for weeks, but I didn't. I was just angry that he wasn't brave enough to at least say goodbye. She paused and looked out at the city. For years, I wondered what I did wrong. Was it because I wasn't good enough? Was it because I didn't deserve to be loved? But then I realized it wasn't my fault. It was his choice. And I can't let someone else's choice define my worth. Conrad listened to every word and felt a strange connection. They came from completely different worlds. He was a Mafia boss. She was Pearl. But both of them carried the wound of betrayal inside them. How did you get past it? He asked. Pearl turned to him, moonlight reflecting in her brown eyes. I didn't get past it. I just learned how to live with it. But I also learned that trusting no one is its own kind of prison. If I close my heart because I'm afraid of getting hurt, then I'll never be betrayed again. Yes, but I'll also never be loved. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people sharing a rare moment of truth. Conrad didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was both of them at once. But when he noticed, his hand was already resting on hers, warm and gentle, as if he were touching something precious and fragile. Pearl didn't pull away. She only looked down at their hands woven together, then lifted her gaze to him. Her brown eyes held no fear, no suspicion, only a quiet acceptance. They stayed there, hand in hand, watching Chicago glitter below. And Conrad realized that for the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel alone. That night, for the first time in 2 years, he held a woman's hand, not because of a transaction or power. He held her hand because he wanted to, and she let him. A few days after that night on the balcony, everything between Conrad and Pearl shifted in subtle ways that only the two of them could sense. Nothing blatant, no declarations or promises, only looks that lingered a little longer, conversations that ran a little deeper, the presence of the other becoming a little more important with each passing day. But then Pearl began to pull back. She still came to work on time, still completed every task with her usual meticulous care, but she avoided private conversations with Conrad. She no longer lingered to talk after finishing her work, no longer sat beside him while he read reports, no longer looked at him with the warm eyes he'd begun to recognize. Conrad noticed immediately. He also realized she was creating distance on purpose, and it irritated him more than any physical pain ever could. 3 days passed in that quiet distance, and Conrad couldn't take it anymore. That afternoon, as Pearl prepared to leave after her shift, he stopped her in the hallway. "Pearl." She halted, but she didn't turn right away. Her back was straight, her shoulders slightly tense, as if she were bracing for a confrontation she'd known was coming. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice polite but distant. "Conrad," he corrected her. "You called me Conrad." "That was a mistake," she replied, finally turning to look at him. "A mistake?" Conrad frowned. "I don't belong in your world," Pearl said, her voice soft but certain. "I'm the Pearl. You're the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago. The distance between us isn't just money or status. It's secrets, danger, darkness I don't belong to." "I don't care whose daughter you are," Conrad said, his voice lower. Pearl shook her head. "But your world does. Do you know what people will say? They'll say, I climbed my way up through a relationship. A gold digger. Someone using a crippled boss." Conrad wanted to argue, wanted to say he didn't care what anyone said, but Pearl went on before he could speak. "And what if it all falls apart? My mother will lose her job. I'll lose everything." Again, her voice trembled slightly on the last word, and Conrad understood she wasn't only talking about work or money. She was talking about a pain she'd already carried, about losing James, about the fear of going through something like that again. "I won't let that happen," Conrad said, his voice softening. Pearl looked straight into his eyes, her brown eyes glinting under the hallway lights. "You don't understand. I'm not strong enough to endure another loss." Conrad wanted to say something, wanted to persuade her, wanted to take her hand the way he had that night on the balcony, but he saw the fear in her eyes, real fear, deep and unhidden, and he understood this wasn't the moment to push. She needed time, she needed space, and if he truly cared about her, he had to respect that. "I'm resigning," Pearl said, her voice smaller now. "My mother is better. She can come back to work, and I need to focus on studying so I can finish my final exam." Conrad felt as if someone had just punched him in the chest. He wanted to say no, to keep her here, to tell her how empty this penthouse would be without her. But he looked into her eyes, saw determination braided with pain, and he knew he couldn't be selfish. "If that's what you want," he heard himself say, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. Pearl nodded, blinking fast as if trying to hold something back. "It's what's best for both of us." Then she turned and walked away, her back straight, her chin lifted. But Conrad noticed her steps were a little faster than usual, as if she were trying to run before her resolve could collapse. He sat there in the silent hallway, watching her vanish behind the elevator doors. The lavender scent she left behind still lingered faintly in the air, but the penthouse was already beginning to feel empty. She wasn't leaving because she felt nothing. She was leaving because she felt something. and that hurt Conrad more than any bullet that had ever torn through his body. 1 week after Pearl resigned, the penthouse on the 50th floor became darker than it had ever been. Conrad turned back into his old self, even worse than before. He smashed furniture, shouted at anyone who dared come near, refused to eat or drink, and locked himself in darkness for entire days. Paxton and Judith were worried but helpless. They were used to their boss's rages. But this time something was different. This wasn't anger. This was collapse. The library Pearl had cleaned so carefully had fallen back into chaos. Books were scattered everywhere, objects lay shattered, and new cracks had appeared on the walls. Conrad sat in the middle of the wreckage, a half-empty whiskey bottle in his hand, staring into nothing. He wondered why he'd let a girl who mopped floors affect him like this. He was Conrad Ashford, a Mafia boss, the man who made all of Chicago afraid. He had already lost his legs, lost his trust, lost his sworn brother. He'd thought there was nothing left for him to lose. But he'd been wrong. Losing Pearl hurt more than everything he'd ever endured. On the morning of the 8th day, an uninvited guest arrived. Judith reported that someone wanted to see him, and before Conrad could refuse, the door opened and Dorothy Whitmore walked in. The 58-year-old cleaning woman, with white-gray hair and kind but sharp eyes, stood in the doorway, looking around the ruined room without any sign of surprise. Then she looked at Conrad, the unshaven man with hollow eyes, sitting among empty bottles and broken glass. "You miss the girl, don't you?" Dorothy asked, her tone as calm as if she were asking about the weather. Conrad didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. Dorothy didn't wait to be invited. She began cleaning the room as if it were still her daily work. Her hands gathered the shards, restacked the books, wiped the spilled liquor staining the floor, all in silence, until she spoke again. "Pearl does too, you know," Dorothy said, her back still turned to Conrad. "She misses you." Conrad lifted his head, reacting for the first time since she'd entered. "She doesn't say it," Dorothy went on, "but I'm her mother. I know. Every night she cries in her room, thinking I can't hear her. But the walls in our house are thin." Conrad felt his chest tighten. Pearl cried. She had cried because of him. She had left with calm resolve, but she had cried. "Then why did she leave?" he asked, his voice rough from days of not speaking to anyone. Dorothy stopped and turned to look at him. Her eyes held no judgment, only the understanding of someone who had lived long enough to grasp the complicated shape of the human heart. "The girl loves you," she said simply, "but she's afraid." "You know why?" Conrad knew. Of course he knew. James, the man Pearl had loved and lost. The pain she'd carried 3 years ago and never truly recovered from. "Pearl isn't afraid you're dangerous," Dorothy said, as if she could read his thoughts. "She isn't afraid of your world. She isn't afraid of your enemies. She's afraid of loving you and losing you, the way she lost James." She paused and sighed. "That girl has kept her heart closed for 3 years. She told me she didn't need love, only work, school, and taking care of me. But then you appeared, and all the walls she built started to crumble. She's afraid of that feeling, afraid of hoping and then losing everything again." Conrad stayed silent, weighing every word Dorothy had said. He'd thought Pearl left because she didn't feel anything for him, because she didn't want to be pulled into his dangerous world. But the truth was the opposite. She left because she did feel something, because she was afraid those feelings would hurt her again. "What should I do?" Conrad asked, his voice smaller than he intended. It was the first time in his life he'd asked anyone for advice about love. Dorothy looked at him, a faint smile passing across her mouth. "That's something you have to decide for yourself. I can only tell you that the girl cried because of you." "She cried. That means you matter to her. But if you want her to come back, you have to show her you're worth the risk, that you won't become another pain in her life." She set the broom down and looked straight into Conrad's eyes. "And you also need to ask yourself whether you're ready to open your heart to someone, or whether you'll keep hiding in this darkness, pushing everyone away, and convincing yourself you don't deserve to be loved." Then she turned away and went back to cleaning as if nothing had happened. But the words she spoke echoed in Conrad's mind all day. Dorothy had shown him what he'd been blind to. Pearl wasn't running from his darkness. She was running from her own pain. And if he wanted her, he had to prove he was worth the risk. One more time. 3 days after the conversation with Dorothy, the bad news came. Paxton walked into Conrad's office with a face more tense than Conrad had ever seen, and Conrad knew at once that something serious had happened. "They have her, boss," Paxton said, his voice thick and low. "Pearl, Sterling Vance. They took her about an hour ago." Conrad's world collapsed in a single instant. The blood in his body seemed to freeze, then boil at once with a rage he'd never felt in his life. Pearl. They had taken Pearl. She had stepped away from him, had tried to stay far from his dangerous world. But that world still found her. Because of him. All because of him. "How?" Conrad asked, his voice cold as ice while something inside him burned. She was on her way home after the night shift at the cafe. A black van, 3 men. Brock's men were shadows. They waited for the slim window of time between her shifts when our guards were changing rotations. "It was a professional hit, boss." Conrad gripped the armrest of his wheelchair so hard his knuckles went white. He'd ordered protection on Pearl 24 hours a day, but when she quit, he'd been foolish enough to think Sterling would stop caring about her. He'd been wrong. Sterling and Brock had watched, had waited for an opening, and he had given them that opening with his own carelessness. "Who did it?" Conrad asked, even though he already knew the answer. "Brock Morrow," Paxton confirmed. "He did it himself. It looks like he knows Pearl matters to you. He wants to use her to apply pressure, to force you to hand over the North Side territory." Conrad pushed up out of his wheelchair, and Paxton went still, not because his boss could stand, but because he had never seen Conrad try to rise on his own like this before. Conrad braced his hands on the desk, his whole body trembling from the effort, but his eyes blazed with a resolve nothing could shake. "Gather everyone," Conrad said, his voice like steel. "All of them. Now." Paxton hesitated. "Boss, we need a plan. Sterling has dozens of men. Brock is dangerous, and they're in their territory. The plan is to bring her back." Conrad cut in, staring straight at Paxton. "At any cost." Paxton understood. After 20 years serving Conrad Ashford, he understood that when his boss said "at any cost," he meant exactly that. He nodded and left to prepare. Conrad lowered himself back into the wheelchair, but inside he no longer felt the helplessness he used to. He was no longer a cripple waiting for others to act. He was Conrad Ashford, a Mafia boss, and the woman he loved needed him. For the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel useless. "They think they've taken my weakness," Conrad murmured to himself. "They don't understand they've just woken the monster I've tried to bury for 2 years. At the same time, in an abandoned warehouse on the southern outskirts of Chicago, Pearl sat on the cold concrete floor, her hands tied behind her back, her mouth gagged with a strip of cloth. Her lip was swollen from the slap she'd taken when she tried to fight back during the kidnapping, but she didn't cry. She'd learned not to cry a long time ago. Brock Morrow stood in front of her, a triumphant smile on his hateful face. He was tall, blonde, and might have been called handsome if not for the vicious glint that always lived in his blue eyes. "So you're the one Conrad Ashford is infatuated with," he mocked, crouching until he was level with Pearl's eyes. "A girl who mops floors? I have to be honest. I thought he had better taste than that." Pearl looked straight into his eyes, not trembling even though her heart was pounding wildly in her chest. She'd heard about Brock from the story Conrad had told, knew he was the man who shot Conrad in the back, knew how dangerous he was, but she also knew that showing fear would only amuse him more. Brock yanked the cloth from her mouth. "Talk. What is it about you that makes the most powerful boss in Chicago care?" Pearl spat in his face. "And what is it about you that made you shoot your own brother in the back?" Brock wiped his face, the smile vanishing, replaced by a flash of fury in his eyes. He slapped Pearl hard enough that her head struck the wall, but she didn't cry out. She only turned her face back toward him, her brown eyes still steady, still refusing to yield. "I'm the one who isn't afraid of you," she said, her voice calm in a way that was almost unbelievable. Brock stared at her for a long moment, then threw his head back and laughed. "We'll see if you're still that brave when Conrad comes and sees you like this. If he can get here." He rose, turned, and walked out of the room. But Pearl followed him with a look he never saw. She knew Conrad would come. She didn't know how she knew, but deep in her heart, she trusted that he wouldn't leave her, and that trust was the only thing keeping her from breaking in this cold, empty room. That night, the black convoy tore through the streets of Chicago like ghosts in the dark. Conrad sat in the lead SUV, dressed in a black suit, gray eyes cold as steel fixed straight ahead. Paxton sat beside him, checking the weapons one last time, while 4 more vehicles followed behind, carrying Conrad's most loyal men. This was the first time in 2 years that Conrad had taken part in an operation like this in person. After the assassination attempt, he'd retreated into darkness, letting Paxton and the others handle everything while he sat in the penthouse, drowning in bitterness and despair. But tonight was different. Tonight, Pearl needed him. "Boss," Paxton spoke up, worry in his voice. "You should stay in the car. Let us handle it." Conrad didn't look at him. "No, I've sat still too long. Tonight, I go." Paxton understood nothing could change his boss's decision, so he only nodded and reviewed the plan one last time. They'd identified Pearl's location, an abandoned warehouse on the southern outskirts of Chicago, deep inside Sterling Vance's territory. It was a trap. Of course they knew that. Sterling and Brock wanted Conrad to come, wanted to use Pearl as bait to destroy the Northside boss once and for all. But they'd underestimated Conrad Ashford. The convoy stopped about 200 meters from the warehouse, and Conrad's team began to deploy. They moved in silence, like shadows, surrounding the building from every direction. Sterling's men were guarding outside, but they didn't expect the danger closing in. Paxton and the elite team handled the guards quickly and efficiently. No gunshots, no shouting, only the small sounds of precise strikes. Within 10 minutes, the path into the warehouse was clear. Paxton pushed Conrad's chair inside, Conrad's gray eyes sweeping the dim space, searching for Pearl's shape. And then he saw her. Pearl sat in the corner, her hands bound behind her, her lips swollen, a bruise already forming on her cheek. But her eyes, those brown eyes, were still bright, still steady, still refusing to yield. And standing between her and Conrad was Brock Morrow, a gun pressed to Pearl's head, a triumphant smile on his mouth. "Look at you, Conrad." Brock laughed loudly. A wheelchair boss coming to save a floor girl. Pathetic. Conrad stared straight at the traitor, the man who'd once been his sworn brother, the man who'd shot him from behind and stolen his legs. For 2 years, Conrad had imagined this moment thousands of times, dreamed of the day he'd face Brock and take revenge for everything Brock had done. But now that the moment was here, he didn't feel hatred. He felt only a cold calm. "At least I'm not the one who shot the man who trusted me," Conrad replied, his voice steady. Brock curled his lip. "Trust? You're too naive, Conrad. In this world, there's no room for trust." "You're wrong," Conrad said, his gaze never leaving Pearl. "Someone taught me you can trust again." Brock lost focus for a second, just a second, trying to understand what that meant. And that second was all Paxton needed. He moved like lightning from the shadows behind Brock, a precise strike to the wrist, sending the gun flying from Brock's hand. Before Brock could react, 2 other men had him pinned, slammed to the floor, his hands bound behind him. Conrad rolled to Pearl and untied her himself. She looked at him, brown eyes shining, and for the first time since she'd been taken, she let tears spill over. "I thought no one would come," she whispered, her voice trembling. Conrad pulled her into his arms, his hand stroking her hair. "I'll always come," he said, his voice hoarse. "Even if I have to crawl on my hands." Pearl cried against his chest, and Conrad held her tight as if she were the most precious thing in the world, because to him, she truly was. And Brock, the traitor, knelt on the floor, waiting for the bullet that would end his life. But Conrad didn't look at him. He only said, his voice like ice, "Don't kill him. Let him live. Let him live with the humiliation that he lost to a man in a wheelchair." Paxton nodded and dragged Brock away. Conrad didn't watch. He only held Pearl, the woman who'd given him a reason to live again. And for the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel useless. He was what she needed, and that was enough. Pearl was brought back to the penthouse to recover after that horrifying night. Conrad didn't leave her side for even a step. He cared for her with his own hands, bringing water, tucking blankets around her, keeping watch by her bed while she slept. It was a reversal no one could have imagined. The one who used to be cared for now becoming the caretaker. The cold Mafia boss now sitting at the bedside of a girl who once mopped floors with a gentleness even he hadn't known he possessed. Judith watched it all from a distance, and her attitude slowly changed. She had once opposed this relationship, had once seen Pearl as an untrustworthy outsider, but watching the way that young woman faced danger, the way she didn't yield to Brock, the way she held on to her dignity even in the worst circumstances, Judith began to understand why her boss loved this woman. "I was wrong about her, Mr. Ashford," Judith said to Conrad on the second day after the rescue. Conrad looked at her and said nothing, waiting. "She isn't what I thought," Judith went on, her voice carrying a trace of regret. "I'm sorry I misjudged her." Conrad gave a small nod. "I've been wrong about a lot of things too." On the second night, Pearl was much better. She sat up in bed and looked out the window where Chicago's lights shimmered in the dark. Conrad sat in the chair beside her bed, the same chair where he'd been sitting for 2 days, and the two of them fell into silence for a long time before either of them spoke. "Pearl," Conrad said, his voice hoarse from nights without sleep. "I love you." Pearl turned to look at him, brown eyes glinting in the dim light. She didn't seem surprised, as if she'd known it for a long time, only no one had said it out loud. "I don't know when it happened," Conrad went on, his voice slow, as if searching for the right words. "Maybe from the first time you walked into my office and looked at me like I was a normal person. You didn't just clean my office, Pearl. You cleared the darkness from my soul. You saw the man behind the shadow, and for that, I am forever yours. I don't know. I only know I love you." Pearl looked at him, tears gathering. "I'm afraid, Conrad," she whispered. Conrad nodded. "I know." "No," she shook her head. "You don't understand. I'm afraid of loving and then losing. I lost once. I'm not sure I can endure that again." Conrad reached out and took her hand. Her hand was small in his, warm, and he could feel her trembling slightly. "I can't promise I'll live forever," he said, his voice low but steady. "No one can promise that. But I can promise that every day I'm alive, I'll love you." Pearl looked at him, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. "How do you know I can love again?" "I don't know," Conrad admitted. "But you taught me I'm still a man, even if I can't stand. Let me teach you that you can love again without having to be afraid. You don't have to face your fear alone. We can be afraid together, and try together." Pearl was quiet for a long time, her brown eyes searching deep into his, as if looking for something. Then she said, her voice light as breath, "I won't promise I won't be afraid. I won't promise it won't be hard. But I'll try." Conrad felt his heart lift, as if a weight he hadn't even known he was carrying had finally been set down. "That's all I need," he said, his voice thick. They held each other in the dim room, not a passionate kiss or vows for forever, just two people who had been hurt, who had lost, who had closed their hearts, now learning how to open them again. Pearl didn't promise she'd love him forever. She only promised she would try. And to Conrad, that was worth more than any vow. A month after the rescue, Conrad publicly acknowledged his relationship with Pearl in front of Chicago's Mafia world. It wasn't an easy decision. He knew there would be whispers, sneers, people who would see this as weakness in the most powerful boss in the city. But he didn't care anymore. He'd spent 2 years in darkness, hiding every feeling, pushing everyone away because he was afraid of being hurt. Now he wanted to live differently, and it began with refusing to be ashamed of loving someone. The rumors spread through Chicago in only a few days. Boss Ashford and the floor girl. Some people mocked, some were skeptical, and plenty saw an opportunity to exploit the situation. Among them was Irene Castellano, the woman who still hadn't given up her ambition to become Mrs. Ashford. Irene appeared at a social function. Conrad had no choice but to attend, and she didn't waste time before throwing out her venom. "She's nothing but a gold digger," Irene said loudly enough for the people around her to hear, "taking advantage while he's weak so she can climb." Typical of that low kind of woman, Pearl was standing not far away and heard every word. But instead of lowering her head or walking away, she stepped straight forward to face Irene, back straight, chin lifted, brown eyes utterly steady. "You can say whatever you want about me," Pearl said, her voice calm but firm. "I don't need to prove anything to you. The only person I need to prove anything to is Conrad. And he's believed in me." Irene curled her lip in contempt. "Who do you think you are? You don't belong in this world." "Maybe I don't," Pearl answered, not wavering, "but I belong beside him. And that's enough." Irene fell silent for a moment, sharp eyes studying Pearl as if reassessing the girl in front of her. Then something strange happened. The hostility on Irene's face slowly dissolved, replaced by something almost like reluctant recognition. "You have something I don't," Irene said, her voice changing, less poisonous than before. Pearl looked at her. "What? You don't need him," Irene replied, her eyes shifting toward Conrad, watching from a distance. "You chose him. Me. I need the position beside him more than I need him himself. That's why he chose you." Then Irene turned away and walked out of the party without looking back. Her chapter in this story was finished. Pearl stood there for a moment, surprised by the sudden shift in her opponent, but she didn't have time to think long, because a commotion on the other side of the room pulled everyone's attention. One of the older bosses, A man around 70 with a silver beard and a heavy belly suddenly collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest, his face turning pale. People panicked, shouting, calling for a doctor, but no one knew what to do. In the middle of the chaos, Pearl moved in. She dropped to her knees beside him, checked his pulse, watched his symptoms, and began the first aid steps she'd learned over 4 years in nursing. Her voice stayed calm as she directed the people around her to call an ambulance and loosen the patient's tie and shirt, while she kept him stable with cardiopulmonary resuscitation. 10 minutes later, the ambulance arrived and took him away. The doctor said that without Pearl's timely intervention, he might not have survived. The entire room looked at Pearl differently now. She wasn't only the floor girl or Boss Ashford's lover anymore. She was the woman who had saved one of Chicago's most powerful men with her knowledge and her calm. Conrad rolled up to Pearl, took her hand, and for the first time in his life, he didn't need to hide the pride he felt for someone. She had conquered his world not with money or power, but with who she was, and he had never been prouder of anyone. The penthouse on the 50th floor was dressed in brilliant color for a special occasion. Gold and silver balloons hung everywhere, shimmering tinsel was wrapped around the railings, and fresh flowers filled the air with fragrance from crystal vases placed on every table. A large banner stretched across the living room, the words written in gleaming gold ink on a red background. "Welcome to the new family." This wasn't a Mafia party filled with backroom deals and false smiles. This was a family party. The family Conrad and Pearl had built together over the past year. Dorothy arrived first, bringing an apple pie she claimed was a family recipe, even though Pearl knew she'd learned it from a cooking show on television. Paxton and his wife were there too, along with Judith, the housekeeper who had once opposed their relationship but had now become one of their most passionate supporters. Even Dr. Raymond was invited, the man who had watched over Conrad's health for 2 years and had witnessed the remarkable change in his patient's spirit since Pearl came into his life. The party wasn't only to celebrate the engagement, but to celebrate everything they'd survived together. They'd survived the distance of class, the whispers of the upper circles, the kidnapping and the dangers from Conrad's enemies, the fear and the old wounds in both of their pasts. They had made it, together. When everyone had gathered, Conrad tapped his wineglass lightly to draw attention. The room gradually fell quiet, everyone turning to look at the boss in the wheelchair, with the woman beside him whom everyone knew had changed his life. "I'm not good at speeches," Conrad began, his voice low but clear, "and I'm not used to talking about feelings. But today, I want to say a few words." He looked at Pearl, and the gray in his eyes softened with an affection no one could doubt. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over. I lost my legs. I lost my trust. I lost everything I thought defined me. I became bitter. I pushed everyone away, and I locked myself in the dark. He paused and drew in a deep breath. Then she appeared, not as an angel or a savior, but as an ordinary girl who mopped floors, with eyes that didn't know fear. She looked at me not as a powerful boss, not as a pitiful cripple. She looked at me like a normal man, and you don't know what that meant to me. Conrad took Pearl's hand, her small, warm hand in his. She taught me I could trust again, that I could love again, that I could live again. She never asked me to change, but because of her, I want to become a better man. Because of her, I want to build a life I can be proud of. He turned and looked straight into Pearl's eyes, tears glimmering in both of them. "Pearl Whitmore, you are the best thing that has ever happened to me. You are the reason I wake up every morning, the light in my darkness, my home, and I promise, every day I have left, I will try to become a man worthy of you." Pearl smiled through her tears, and she spoke too, her voice trembling slightly but full of happiness. "I don't need you to become anyone else, Conrad. I only need you to be you. That's all I ever wanted." The room applauded. Dorothy wiped her tears with a flower-embroidered handkerchief. Paxton stood so straight he looked like a soldier saluting, and Judith discreetly dabbed at the corner of her eye even as she tried to keep her composure. Amid the laughter and congratulations, Pearl leaned her head against Conrad's shoulder and whispered, "I love you." Conrad kissed her forehead softly. "I love you more." And in that moment, among the people he loved, inside the penthouse that had once been cold and empty and was now filled with laughter, Conrad Ashford realized he'd found what he'd thought he'd lost forever. Not his legs, not power, not other people's fear, but love, family, home. It was late, the party had ended, and the penthouse returned to its familiar quiet. But this was no longer the cold, empty quiet it used to be. This was the quiet of peace, of contentment, of a real home. Conrad and Pearl sat on the balcony, looking down at Chicago glittering below with millions of lights like millions of stars fallen to the earth. The night wind carried the chill of autumn, but they had a warm blanket. They had each other's arms. They had everything they needed. Pearl sat beside Conrad's wheelchair, her head resting on his shoulder, her fingers woven through his. A simple silver ring shone on Conrad's finger, proof of the promise they'd given each other that afternoon in the small park. "Conrad," Pearl spoke, her voice gentle in the still night. "Do you regret it?" Conrad asked, knowing she was asking about something deeper. "About everything." Pearl lifted her head to look at him. About loving a mafia boss in a wheelchair? About being kidnapped, threatened, pulled into your dangerous world? About giving up a normal life to stand beside a man all of Chicago fears? Conrad nodded, gray eyes on her with a worry he rarely allowed to show. He knew she'd sacrificed a great deal to be with him, and sometimes he wondered whether it was worth it. Pearl smiled and raised a hand to lightly trace the faint scar on his cheek, a remnant of the horrific night 2 years ago. "Not for a single second," she said, her voice certain. "I'd choose you 1,000,000 times if I had to do it again." "Why?" Conrad asked, his voice rough. "Because you saw me," Pearl answered simply. "Not the waitress, not the woman who saw him, not some powerless person who needed saving. You saw me as me, and I saw you as you. Not the boss, not the cripple, just a man. A man I love." Conrad held her tighter, feeling her warmth in his arms, feeling her steady heartbeat alongside his. He'd lived 37 years, had known the heights of power and the depths of despair, but he'd never felt as whole as he did right now. "You know," he said, his voice low in the night, "before I met you, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd spend whatever time I had left in bitterness and loneliness, and then die without anyone truly remembering me. But you changed everything." Pearl lifted her head. "I didn't change anything. You changed yourself." Conrad shook his head. "No, you gave me a reason to change. You gave me hope when I thought I had nothing left to hope for. You gave me love when I thought I didn't deserve to be loved. You gave me a home when I'd forgotten what home was." They sat in silence, watching Chicago slowly drift into sleep. Lights winked out one by one. Streets grew quieter. But out on this balcony, time seemed to pause. "Conrad," Pearl said after a long while, her voice carrying a hesitation that was rare for her. "I want to ask you something." "Ask. Do you ever think about the future? About us?" Conrad turned to look at her, his gray eyes deep in the dim light. "Every day," he answered. "I think about waking up beside you every morning. About building a life with you. About growing old with you." He paused and tightened his grip on her hand. "And I think about becoming the man you deserve. I may never stand up from this wheelchair. I may carry the scars of the past forever. But I promise you, every day, I'll try to be a better version of myself. For you. For us." Pearl smiled, tears glimmering at the corners of her eyes. "I don't need you to be perfect, Conrad. I only need you to be you. And I want to build that future with you. No matter what happens." Conrad bent down and kissed her forehead, then her nose, and finally her lips. The kiss was light and gentle, carrying every promise they didn't need to say out loud. When they pulled apart, Pearl yawned softly, brown eyes heavy with sleep. Conrad smiled, a real smile that only she ever got to see. "Let's go to bed," he said. "Tomorrow we still have an entire future ahead of us." Pearl nodded, stood, and pushed his wheelchair back inside. They passed through the living room, where the scent of flowers and the laughter of the party still lingered, passed through the hallway where expensive paintings hung on the walls, and finally into the bedroom that was now theirs. That night, Conrad lay beside Pearl, listening to her steady breathing, feeling her warmth at his side, and he realized this was what he'd been searching for his entire life, without ever knowing it. Not power, not money, not other people's fear, but love, belonging, home. Outside the window, Chicago was still cold. Rain was probably falling somewhere in the city. There were still people out there who were lonely, desperate, wondering whether anyone wanted them at all. But in this room, in the arms of the woman the world called ordinary, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago had found what he thought he'd lost forever. A home, a family, a love, a forever. The story of Conrad Ashford and Pearl Whitmore had come to a close, but the lessons it left behind would remain. That true love doesn't care about status or circumstance. That self-respect and sincerity are worth more than any wealth in the world. That sometimes, the most ordinary people have the power to heal the deepest wounds. That it's never too late to open your heart, to trust, to love again. And most importantly, that everyone deserves to be seen as themselves, not through a title, not through circumstance, but simply as a human being. My dear friends, the story of the ruler and the floor girl has reached its ending. How do you feel about Conrad and Pearl's journey? In real life, can love overcome every barrier like that? Have you ever met someone who truly saw the real you? Please share your feelings and thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear the stories and experiences from your own hearts. If this story touched you, please press the like button and share this video with your loved ones. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next moving stories we'll bring you every day. Finally, we wish all of you watching this video good health, a life full of joy, and peaceful days beside the people you love. Thank you for being with us through this entire story. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.